What's up everybody, Mr. Forrest back with a series I have been waiting a long time to film. I am so glad we finally got the opportunity. And for those of you who are watching right now at Epic Bible Fun, I miss you guys. I wish I could be with you in person, but hopefully this is the next best thing. So everybody sit up super straight, eyes on me, buckle up, because here we go. The team made up of Mike, Ed, Sheila, and Steve wanted a name for themselves. I know, Mike said, how about the Marvelous Mob? Sheila said, no, I kind of like the Curious Crew. Steve said, well, why not the Peculiar Posse? And then Ed chimed in. How about the uncanny, outlandish, weird but wonderful, atypical, eccentric, idiosyncratic, complimentary company of ice cream loving, pizza eating, bike riding, snake hunting, candy guzzling human individuals who when put together make the most perfectest team in the galaxular region of the universe? Everybody looked at Ed. Maybe I shouldn't be in charge of naming us. They all settled on the name Mess. Mess because, well, they were a mess, and it was the first letter in each of their names. Mike, Ed, Sheila, and Steve. School was almost out and they were looking forward to the best summer of their entire lives. They were looking forward to no school, no homework, no bullies like Chad Gonzalez and Joseph Lewis, no extracurricular activities or sports. Only friend time. They planned on spending every day together. They were going to ride their bikes down to Mills Pond. They were going to go to the old school video arcade. They were going to watch movies and eat popcorn. They were going to ride their bikes down to the 7-Eleven and eat Big Bites and drink Slurpees and play the Skittle Drool game. Now, the Skittle Drool game is where you eat a bunch of Skittles so your saliva is super thick. And then you bend over and you let your saliva drip out of your mouth and then you suck it back in, and you see who can drool the farthest without it breaking off and be able to suck it all the way back in. You guys can guess who invented that game. However, you'd be surprised as to who won that game. It was Sheila. She won every single time. Well, summer came, and it was the first Monday of summer. School was finally out. The kids went to the giant Weiss Wright Landis Mart to get Skittles to play the Skittles game. They always argued over who would go in first. Mike and Steve felt like they were the leaders, and therefore they should go in first. Sheila didn't really want to go in first, but she hated being last, and there was no other option. It was either be first or be last, because Ed was always doing Ed things like turning his clothes around in reverse, putting his glasses on the back of his head, and walking around backwards to see if anybody would notice. Or sometimes he'd be sniffing already chewed gum that was on the sidewalk. Well, on this particular day, Mike said, guys, I'm going in first. And Sheila said, hang on, you went first last time. And she grabbed Mike's arm and she spun him around. Meanwhile, Steve somersaulted, tumbling in, stood up and said, ta-da, I'm in first. And Mike said, oh no, you're not. And he grabbed Steve and he body slammed Steve. Sheila jumped into the fray and she started cowtailing everyone. Let me explain. Sheila loved this candy called cowtails. She would eat a bunch of them and they would make her super hyper. And when she was hyper, she would do Ed type of things. Like she would hang upside down from a tree branch and when kids would walk by, she'd say, I'm a piñata, who wants some candy? Or she'd do 200 push-ups in a row. Every time she'd do a push-up, she'd be like, I'm stronger than your mama. I'm stronger than your mama. I'm stronger than your mama. But most of all, more than anything else, she would hit people with her braid. Sheila had long hair and she wore it in a single braid down her back. And she would take her braid and she would swirl it around and she would whip someone with it and say things like, get cowtailed, punk, or you done been cowtailed, fool, or you like the cowtail? Have another. So the boys were wrestling and Sheila was in there whipping them with her cowtail. Meanwhile, they heard a sound above them. All the kids looked up and Ed went flying over their heads like Superman. He did a flip. He landed on one knee like Iron Man. Mike, Sheila, and Steve were shocked. Ed himself was shocked. Ed was the clumsiest kid they knew. Ed was so proud of himself, He stood up and he started taking a bow as if there was an audience around. He started waving. He started doing the Ed dance. Whenever Ed was proud of himself, he'd do the Ed dance. Well, here's what happened. Ed was outside and he found a piece of already chewed gum on the sidewalk, and he was bent over sniffing it, and he couldn't get a real good smell, so he tried to pick it up, but it was extra hot outside, and this was a new kind of gum with extra elasticity, and so Ed pulled and pulled, and it stretched and it stretched and it stretched, and because it was already chewed, it was a little bit slippery. It slipped out of his hands and boing! It shot across the parking lot. It hit an old lady who stumbled in front of a car. The car swerved to miss the old lady and hit a shopping cart. The shopping cart went careening toward Ed, undercut him, hitting him in the legs, causing him to flip and fly through the air and land as gracefully as he's ever landed in his entire life. Ed was proud of himself and he was doing the Ed dance, but then suddenly there was a flashing light. There was the sound of the alarm. The kids were all afraid that they did something wrong. The manager of the store came running toward the kids and he pointed and said, "You!" And Mike was usually the one who was in trouble, so Mike was like, "Me?" And he's like, "No, not you. You!" And he pointed right at Ed. And Ed was like, "Me?" And he said, "Do you realize what you've done?" And Ed said, "I'm really sorry." And he broke down into tears, "But I just can't help it. I'm so curious to know what already chewed gum, what flavor it was, and what the previous chewer's breath smelled like. And how was I supposed to know it was going to be extra elasticy?" And it slipped out of my fingers and flipped through the air and hit an old lady who stumbled in front of a car, and the car swerved and hit a shopping cart, which hit me and caused me to flip and fly through the air, and I landed gracefully for once in my entire life. Please don't sue me." The manager just stared at Ed, blinking. He looked at the other kids and said, "He's the weird one, isn't he?" The other kids were like, he said, "No, you don't understand, kid. You're our 1 millionth customer." Ed said, "I'm sorry, I'll never be your 1 millionth customer ever again." The manager said, "Stop apologizing, kid. You won." And Ed said, "I did? Oh yeah, I did." And he started doing the Ed dance again. And Sheila said, well, what did he win?" And the manager said, "You and 5 people of your choice get an all-expense-paid trip to the incredible, the awesome, the amazing." "Oh, where? Jamaica? Hawaii? Japan?" "Churchill, Manitoba. That's where I grew up. You're going to love it. I'll go draw up the paperwork now." The manager left, and the kids, meanwhile, were looking at each other. What did he just say? Mike said, "I think he said a church on a hill with a banana." Sheila said, No. He said a sledding hill in Panama. Steve said, "There are no sledding hills in Panama." He said a delicious empanada. But Ed knew. Ed said, no. He said Churchill, Manitoba. Ed had studied it in school, and he was excited out of his mind. The kids got back to Ed's house as quickly as they could, and Ed's dad was working on his car, and they chattered it out to him, and he was so surprised he accidentally squirted himself in the face with oil. They ran inside to tell Ed's mom, and she was so shocked she dropped a plate on the floor. After Dad cleaned up and changed clothes and Mom swept up the mess, they sat in the living room to have a powwow. Everybody sat in a circle. They were all in shock. None of them had ever won anything important like this in their entire lives. Finally, Dad asked the question, "Well, Ed, who are you going to bring? You could bring 5 people. And you just have me and your mom. Mary's on a mission trip this summer. That leaves 3 more people. Where are we going to find 3 people to bring with us on an epic adventure?" Mike cleared his throat. Steve fluffed his fro. Sheila batted her eyes. Ed said, "I know. Mike, Sheila, Steve. Can you guys think of anyone we could bring?" And the kids were like, "Oh." Ed said, "Just kidding. Of course I'm going to bring you guys. This is our summer together, remember?" The kids were so excited, even though they weren't going to leave for a week, they went home that night and they packed everything they would need. Everything they would need for an epic adventure, for the journey of a lifetime, for an Arctic chill. The week went by fast and the day of travel finally came. The kids got on a big plane that was going to Seattle, and it was so comfortable and roomy. Every one of them had a big comfy chair to sit in, and they all sat together in the same row, and each of them had a personal TV with thousands of movies that they could watch, and they all watched Despicable Me 2 at the same time. They all watched Finding Dory at the same time. They all watched the same episodes of Looney Tunes at the same time. It was such a fun flight, and after hours and hours and hours of flying all the way across the country, they finally landed. Whew, Ed said, "We're here in Churchill, Manitoba." And Ed's dad said, "No, actually you're not. That was just our first flight. We had another flight to take us to Winnipeg." Ed said, "Another flight?" They had a 6-hour layover. They slept, they ate, they went to the bathroom, they were bored. They finally boarded their next plane. They got on the next plane that was headed to Winnipeg, but this time they didn't sit together, so if they wanted to communicate, they had to annoy everyone around them and holler over people. They didn't have their own personal TV, and the seats were tight and squishy. This flight felt even longer, even though it wasn't. Finally, they landed, and Ed said, "Whew, we're here in Churchill, Manitoba." And Dad said, "No, actually we're not." Ed said, "You said we only had one more flight." Dad said, "Well, we do, but there are no flights that go to Churchill. We have to take the train." Ed said, "Well, how long's that gonna take?" Dad said, "About 2 days." 2 days? Ed thought this would be the most boring 2 days of his entire life, but as soon as they got on the train, he realized how wrong he was. The kids looked out the window, and for the first 4 hours of the trip, nobody said a word. It was 1,000 miles of subarctic beauty. It was the most incredible scenery they had ever seen in their lives, and they were enjoying every second of it. They didn't want it to end. If the grand prize was just to see this scenery, they would have accepted it. Finally, after about 4 hours, the kids got together and they played some cards and they played some Clash Royale and they ate a snack. Now, this was weird about the train. The only food they served on the train was microwavable food. And the problem is, when Mike ate Hot Pockets, it did terrible things to his stomach that made his toots smell like nuclear waste. So they begged Mike to eat trail mix instead. Later that night, the kids were all sitting around one of the tables in the train car and they were playing cards. And Ed accidentally won. I say accidentally because he had never won a card game in his life because he never paid attention to the rules. He always did weird Ed things. Like on this particular night, he was licking the cards and he was sticking them to various parts of his body, his forehead, his nose, his elbows, his knees. And then he had to sneeze. And as soon as he sneezed, two, they all fell off his body at the same time, face up, and it was a winning hand. Sheila said, "Whoa, Ed, you actually won." He said, "I did? I mean, of course I did." And he started doing the Ed dance again. And then he stopped. He was staring at something on the window or maybe out the window. And Ed ran to the window as fast as he could. It was almost like the window was a magnet and Ed was made of metal. It was like... Now the kids were used to Ed doing weird things on the window, like he would lick the window to see what flavor it was. He would blow his nose on the window and make little sculptures and pictures of Elvis. But the kids knew he wasn't up to his normal shenanigans because he was just staring and his mouth was wide open. The kids ran to the window to see what he was looking at. When they looked out, what they saw took their breath away. They saw Aurora Borealis, the northern lights. Once again, the kids just stared out the window, speechless. More beauty than they had ever seen in their entire lives. As they stared out the window, they were thinking what a magical night it was. Steve looked at Aurora Borealis and he thought, this night is magical. Ed found a piece of already chewed gum underneath the seat and had pulled it off and put it in his mouth. This gum is magical. Mike heated up another Hot Pocket and he was saying, this Hot Pocket is magical. Sheila was staring at Steve thinking, his hair is magical. And Ed looked up past Aurora Borealis and up and up and up. Now, where Ed lived, he might see like 3 or 4 stars at night, and that's it. But everywhere he looked, there were millions Billions of stars. He had never seen so many stars in his entire life. Finally, Ed broke the silence and he said, "Guys, I think there might be at least 37, maybe 38 stars in our galaxy." Everybody looked at Ed. He said, "In fact, our galaxy might even be as big as my whole neighborhood." Everybody just looked at Ed. Just then the train car started filling with this strange green mist. "Oh, Mike, did you eat a Hot Pocket?" Mike's like, "I cannot help it. I'm digestively challenged." The kids are like, "What does it do? Burn a hole in your Batuski?" Oh! They all started laughing, and just then the door to the train car opened and a stranger came stumbling in. A strange man who looked maybe confused or sad or angry or frustrated or all of the above. They couldn't figure out which. And when he stumbled in, his jacket opened a little bit and Sheila thought she saw what looked like the handle of a gun in his belt. The man looked around and then stumbled out real fast. And the kids thought he stumbled out because he smelled Mike's nuclear toots. So they didn't think too much of it, but Sheila tucked that away in her mind. And she didn't forget what that man looked like. After a while, the kids decided to go to bed. They had a big day the next day. The next day, they stopped in a town called Thompson. They had a 5-hour layover in Thompson. Plenty of time to get out of the train, to stretch their legs, to go for a walk, to hit the mall in Thompson and restock on supplies. Ed bought some Mike and Ike's. Steve bought some Red Vine's licorice. Sheila bought some cowtails. Mike bought some Hot Pockets. The kids goofed around in the mall and visited the different shops and tried on weird clothes. Ed tried on a pink cowboy hat with blue cowboy shoes. Sheila put on a dress that looked as much like a wedding dress as could possibly look without the actual dress. Wearing the dress, Sheila felt like it was her wedding day. In fact, she was whisked away into a daydream where she and Steve were standing at the altar, where the pastor had said, "I now pronounce you man and wife, you may kiss the bride." She leaned in, she gave Steve a kiss, and "Sheila, what are you doing?" Sheila snapped out of it, realized she had been kissing the mirror. "Go away, Mike, it's none of your business." She scuttled into the dressing room and slammed the door. Mike thought, girls are so weird. The kids laughed and talked on their way back to the train. They played the Skittles drool game, and of course Sheila won. They got within eyeshot of the train station and they noticed, "Oh, where's our train?" Steve said, "It's right there!" The train had already started pulling away. Ed's dad had warned them. They had to be back on time. The train would not wait for them. The train was already moving. Mike looked around and said, "What do we do?" And Steve yelled, "We run!" And all 4 kids, as fast as they could, ran toward the train. Now, Sheila was light on her feet and she was spunky, so she was fast. Steve was an athlete, so he was fast. Now, Mike was an athlete, but he was the biggest kid in the whole school and he wasn't necessarily fast. Ed was not athletic at all. He was super clumsy, so he was not fast. As the kids ran as fast as they could, Sheila and Steve got to the train first. They jumped onto the caboose. They held out their hand like this and said, "Run, guys, run!" Ed ran as fast as he possibly could, surprised that he didn't trip and fall. He reached out. Steve's hand grabbed his. Sheila's hand grabbed his other hand. They brought Ed in. They pulled him up and in and turned around and said, "Come on, Mike, come on." Mike was still a ways away, but he knew he needed to dig deep. Ed said, "Pretend that you're running after a Hot Pocket." Mike ran as fast as he possibly could. And here's how they reached for Mike. Ed and Sheila grabbed Steve's belt and they leaned him way over to get closer. Mike's fingertips were almost there, almost making contact. They made contact. Steve went to grab and it slipped. Mike kind of stumbled and it set him a few steps back. Meanwhile, the train was moving faster and faster. They yelled, "Give it everything you got, Mike, come on." And Steve held out his hand and Mike held out his hand and they missed. And one more time, Mike fell a few steps behind. They said, "Mike, you gotta do it. This is your last chance." His lungs were burning. His legs were aching. His whole body felt like it was just gonna collapse. But he ran as fast as he could. He reached out one last time and they got him! They got him! Steve yelled back, "Pull! pull. Sheila and Ed pulled with every ounce of strength they had. Steve pulled with every ounce of strength he had, and they got Mike into the train, and then Mike fell backwards. They reached out and grabbed Mike by the shirt. Mike was hanging by his shirt. He was looking backwards. His face was inches from the track. He was feeling the pelt on his face of gravel and pebbles. Mike yelled, "Don't let me die! I still have Hot Pockets to eat!" And they pulled one more time with every ounce of strength that they had and pulled Mike into the train, and all four kids collapsed onto the ground. None of them could remember a time being as exhausted as they were in that moment. They lay on the ground trying to catch their breath. They sat up, they went into the train car, they drank water, tried to hydrate. Ed's parents came in and said, "Hey, what happened to you guys?" And they told him the story. Mike didn't speak. He didn't speak for a long time. The kids wanted to give him his space because that was a close call. Ed decided to open his Bible and he was reading in Ephesians. Finally, Mike spoke. Mike said, "Guys, do you realize I could have died today?" Ed's eyes got super wide and he looked down at his Bible. He said, "Mike, you're dead already." Sheila said, "I'll say every time he eats a Hot Pocket, it smells like something died." Ed said, "No, Sheila, I'm being serious." And he read Ephesians 2, verse 1. "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins." Ed said, "Mike, according to God's word, right now, because you are a sinner, you are spiritually dead. But not only that, look at verse 12. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenant of promise, having no hope and without God in the world." Ed said, "Mike, because you are a sinner and you have not repented and believed on Jesus, right now you are dead in sin. Right now you are separated from God, farther away than the stars above Aurora Borealis. Because of your sin, you are separated from God." Mike didn't like to think of himself as a sinner. Mike liked to think of himself as a pretty good guy who sometimes makes mistakes. A lot of people think of themselves that way. "Well, I'm not as bad as her. Well, at least I'm better than him. I make mistakes, but nobody's perfect." Guys, that's your own sin deceiving you. The truth is, we are lying, cheating, selfish, anger-filled, hate-filled rebels against God. And because of our sin, we are spiritually dead and separated from God. And Mike thought about it for a minute. In school, in order to keep his grade point average up, Mike cheated kind of a lot. He wanted to play football. In order to play football, he had to get decent grades. So to ensure that, he would cheat. When adults weren't around, sometimes Mike would say bad words. Sometimes Mike was mean to other people. He would say mean things and kind of act like a bully. Mike was often selfish and self-centered. When people were mean to Mike, he would hate them. Oftentimes, Mike would disobey his parents. He would sneak things behind their backs. He would get a bad attitude with them. He would talk back to them. Mike thought about it, and Mike thought, maybe I am a sinner. Maybe I am separated from God. But guys, it's not just Mike. Look at verse 3. "Among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body." The truth is, the Bible teaches that we are all sinners. That means Mike, that means me, that means you. And it's our sin that makes us spiritually dead and separated from God. The next day, the kids woke up and they were in Churchill, Manitoba. And they were about to have the adventure of a lifetime. To be continued. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Arctic Chill. Our memory verse today is Ephesians 2, verse 1. "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins." And our first epic truth is this. Hold up one finger. I am a sinner. Guys, it's time we admitted it. So many people walk around saying, well, they're all sinners, but not me. But the Bible says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In Ephesians 2 verse 3, it says, among whom we all once lived. Guys, that's bad news. We're going to get to the good news, so stay tuned. If you're watching live right now at EBF, we're going to pick 3 people who are sitting up the straightest and paying the closest attention. If you're watching on YouTube, guys, I'll see you next time. But until then, Mr. Forrest out.